Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of WIA Talks. I have a very special guest with us today, but before I introduce her, may I just tell you a little bit about Women in Africa for people who are joining us for the first time. Women in Africa is the preeminent platform supporting women leaders across the continent of Africa. We have members in all 54 African countries. We're supported by a network of ambassadors, and we run programs specifically targeted at women entrepreneurs because we believe that through the economy, we can transform the continent. WIA was founded 4 years ago by a renowned French entrepreneur called Aude Twan in Europe. And she founded WIA because African women came to her and said, "You'd founded the Women's Forum for the Economy and the Society, and it was such a huge platform. It had all the biggest leaders all around the world supporting women leaders. We want the same for women in Africa." And so Aude created WIA and recruited me to be first on the board, or first ambassador, then on the board, and now I'm president of the organization. My name is Hafsat Abiola Costello, and we would love for you, if you're very interested in Africa, if you're an African woman, we would love for you to join our network and begin to work with us as we strengthen the women entrepreneurs on the continent and transform the continent's future. Today, we bring to you a very special guest. I was trying to remember when I first met Dr. Dambisa Moyo, and I think it was about 25 years ago. And I remember exactly where it was. I was walking with one of my teachers, who was a very good friend of Dr. Dambisa, Siddhartha Mitra. Yes, and I was walking past Kennedy School of Government, and this very petite African woman called Siddhartha Mitra, it was Dr. Dambisa. At the time, she was not a doctor. She was doing a master's degree at the Kennedy School. And we became friends. She was an older sister, she was a mentor, she was a friend, and we've been friends since. But from those early days at the Kennedy School, she's gone on to do such incredible things. And I know this is not someone that needs any introduction, but I will go ahead and share with you some of what she's been about. She's a global economist, author, an investor, and a marathon runner. I have to tell you, Dambisa, that, I used to do track. I used to do short distance. I cannot comprehend marathon running. So I'm hoping that maybe you'll have some tips. She's a preeminent thinker around the issues of development, bringing new ideas to key decision makers about strategic investment and public policy. She's respected widely for her unique perspectives, a balance of thinking with measured judgment, but bringing really cutting-edge, innovative ideas that are rarely heard in the domain. And she has a unique ability to turn economic insight into investable ideas. Dr. Dambisa is an honorary fellow of the Foreign Policy Association and a member of the Bretton Woods Committee. She's a board member of 3M and Chevron and Condé Nast, and she holds a PhD in economics from Oxford, a master's from Harvard, and is recognized for fresh and innovative ideas as the author of 4 New York Times bestselling books: The Edge of Chaos, Why Democracy is Failing to Deliver Economic Growth and How to Fix It, Winner Take All, China's Race for Resources and What It Means for the World, and How the West Was Lost, 50 Years of Economic Folly and the Stark Choices Ahead. And the very first book that she wrote that shook the whole world was Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. She is named as one of the Times 100 most influential people in the world. She writes for the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Harvard Business Review, The Economist, which she did last 2 months ago, and has traveled to 80 countries. Probably, Dr. Dambisa, that was when you were working with Goldman Sachs. So Dr. Dambisa has earned a strong reputation as a top-tier opinion former and trusted advisor on macroeconomics, geopolitics, technology, and millennial themes. I want to say something else about Dr. Dambisa Moyo, and from now I'm going to be calling her Sissy Dambisa, which is what I call her. And that is just that whenever I hear you speak, I just feel so very proud. You're so articulate, so clear, so concise, and really very powerful. And so I just am so excited to share you with the WIA community today. People have been writing us all week as soon as we sent the flyer out that we'll be interviewing you. And some people were like, she's my idol. Some people said that they used you in all their master's work, all their PhD work. So I've promised some people that couldn't make the interview, I promised to send it to them so they can see. But we have about 200 people that registered today. So without much more ado, I want to begin our conversation by asking you what you think globally, given the post-COVID economic situation, what do you think the world is going to look like post-COVID for the world, but also made specifically for Africa?
First of all, I want to just say I'm so delighted to be able to participate in this discussion, very important discussion. But really, more than anything, it's just a pleasure for me to spend time with you, Hafsat, junior sister, as I call you. You're right, we've known each other since Harvard days. You know, it's such a pleasure and an honor for me to see you grow up to such an amazing, exceptional woman who's always trend-setting and breaking barriers. And you are a great pride, not just to me, but really to the African continent. And I'm delighted to support you on this occasion. To your specific question, what does the world look like after COVID? It's a wonderful question because I've spent a lot of the past 4 months going back in history. You know, we very often we ignore the past and we just think we know, everything about today as being different and the future has nothing to do with the past. And I think we make a big mistake by taking that attitude. And I just want to maybe take us back to the period in the United States known as the Gilded Age, which was roughly from 1870 to 1900. I know, especially for millennials and younger, that will seem like an eternity ago, but I think it's really important in answering your question. During that period, the United States in particular, but really the developed world, experienced a handful of things that we will come back to realize are very familiar. It was a period of high economic growth. It was a period of a lot of trade, so globalization between regions. It was a period where corporations were extremely strong. And it was a period where there were a lot of oligopolies. So by that, I mean few companies representing different sectors. But it was also a period of relatively weak government. And it was also a period, unfortunately, in which we saw a widening of income inequality. And I won't bore you with the details, but basically the United States entered into 1900, the turn of the last century. And there were three things that happened. First of all, you had a World War I between 1914 and 1918. It was quickly followed in 1918 to 1920 with the Spanish flu, which killed about 100 million people, 100 million people. And as we can think about COVID, just think for a moment, 100 million people were killed by that disease in 2 years. And we're only at 14 million right now infected. So just think about percentage of the population at that time, but it was a massive, massive problem. But the third thing that happened was that we saw a Great Depression that was triggered by the 1929 stock market crash. So you might be saying to yourself, well, why are you telling me this? What does it matter? Well, it matters because in response to those three triggers from 1900 to 1930, what you then saw was a progressive government that emerged. So what do I mean? We then saw a period of, instead of high economic growth, we had low economic growth. Instead of globalization, we saw much more protectionism. Smoot-Hawley was the policy that came out of the United States, which limited global trade. In fact, they put trade tariffs on over 3,000 goods and services. Instead of strong corporations, we had antitrust law brought in by the Sherman Antitrust Act, which basically made companies like the Rockefeller Standard Oil, the railways, broke them up to make them smaller businesses. We also saw a period in which government started to act against income inequality. So we see a very, very large welfare state in the United States through the New Deal that emerged. And government, if you recall, I said to you, government had been very weak. In fact, between 1850 and 1900, all the presidents in the United States only served one term. But what you see in the progressive era in the United States is that for the first time in recent history, you have a president that served 3 terms. FDR served 3 terms.
Is my favorite.
There you go. But he came up with the New Deal, created this welfare state. So that was to really address income inequality. And so we see essentially an unwinding of everything that really was symbolic of the Gilded Age being unwound. I want to just also point out one other thing, which is to say that after the crash in 1929 of the stock market, which I mentioned to you as one of these triggers for this new era, the next time, by the way, at that time, the stock market had reached a peak of 381 points, Dow Jones Industrial. The economy hit a very, very prolonged period of high unemployment, low economic growth. The next time the world saw Dow Jones Industrial at 381 points was 20 years later, in the 1950s. And I think historians and economists broadly agree that the only way that the United States and the world as a whole managed to get out of that economic malaise was because World War II started in 1939. Now, I'm not here to say we have to go into another war or there's another war coming, but I want to remind you where we've been prior to 2008, okay? We had a period of high economic growth. The world saw the countries like the BRICS, emerging markets like led by China, very, very high economic growth around the world. We saw a world in which much more globalization on the back of a Washington consensus, lots of trade, lots of capital flows, lots of immigration, lots of exchange of ideas. We saw corporations become big and strong. Think about every sector that you can. And not only these companies become big, but a natural tendency or trend back towards more oligopolies. Think about banking, pharmaceuticals, energy companies, mining companies, technology companies. For each of these sectors, there are just a handful of companies that are dominating. And perhaps worst of all, we saw income inequality starting to widen. This has been a very big issue. When I was doing my PhD at Oxford, nobody talked about income inequality. All of a sudden, income inequality for the past 10 years has become a dominant theme in public policy and in politics. So what then happened? 2008, we have a financial crisis. So the reason that is important is because in my mind, even before COVID hit this year, the pandemic, the global economy was already in a very difficult place. It was a world where both developed and developing countries had low, slow, and in some cases, no economic growth. It was already a world in which companies and countries were struggling under enormous amounts of debt coming out of the financial crisis. A lot of governments were already struggling with enormous deficits. So we were already worried about the global economy, especially since public policy had become what was seen as quite impotent. We had negative interest rates in some countries. We had a situation where there was a very big threat to globalization. Essentially, and this is sorry to take so long to explain this, but essentially, we now are even in a worse place because COVID has hit. So in answering your question, what do I think is going to happen next? Well, I'm afraid we have to go back in history. And I think we're about to enter into what I see as a very progressive era, which would be characterized by bigger government. That means more taxes, more regulation. I think it's going to mean much more debt. And already, if you look at the US, for example, every class of debt, government debt, household debt, corporate debt, credit card debt, auto loans, student loans are all at $1 trillion each. And the global consequences, because the US government, as you know, has China as its largest foreign lender, the complications around that we've not even begun to see. I think there's a risk of greater breakup of companies, as we saw with Standard Oil back in the 1900s. We could see that again. I do worry a lot that we are going to see a situation of more deglobalization, more protectionism. We've already seen that in terms of immigration. We're going to see more of it in terms of trade, in terms of capital flows. The splinter net, the fact that there are two competing internets that could evolve in the next 10 years between China and the West. But perhaps most worrying from my perspective is that we are in for a period of low economic growth. And just to finish up here, I would just put it to you that in order for a country to meaningfully put a dent in poverty, by that I mean in order to double per capita incomes in one generation, which is 24 to 25 years, a country has to be growing at least at 3% per year. Most countries, big and small, so developed and developing economies, are growing way below that 3% number. The African region, many parts of the African continent are growing below 3%. Germany, last 2019, its final quarter, it grew at 0%. That was before COVID hit. So I'm afraid that the story doesn't really give us much confidence because governments are already struggling with debt, and the population continues to get big. Our expectations around where the world is going, I worry, is getting much more complicated in a world that's much more in competition than in cooperation.
That doesn't sound optimistic. But in your article in The Economist magazine, you put forward a case for a global Marshall Plan for Africa. Could you outline what that would look like and why you think it is necessary? Is it because of what you've just said?
It's necessary for three reasons. There's a health imperative, there's an economic imperative, and then there's what I would call an ideological or geopolitical imperative. The health imperative is very simple. According to the World Health Organization, a country needs to be spending somewhere between $34 to $40 per person per year in the healthcare system. Unfortunately, in Africa, many governments are unable to even cover that amount. And the article was targeting Africa, but the truth of the matter is not just Africa. Around the world, even in developed countries, poor communities in developed countries do not have access to quality healthcare which would be calculated as around $34 to $40 per head per year. So number one, we are fully exposed to an economic, a healthcare problem. Problem number two I've outlined is an economic one. Africa remains, and in fact, by a lot of estimates, will represent 40% of world population growth by the end of this century. It is a huge growth engine in terms of the world's population, but we're not delivering economic growth that can satiate the needs of that population. We need to be growing, as I mentioned, at least 3%. And given the whole host of problems, lack of investment, deteriorated public goods. I was just in South Africa and home in Zambia. You have load shedding where you don't even have reliable, cost-effective electricity. these things are all coming together, which really means economically we're fully exposed. You add to that China's, the fact that China now is the biggest lender in the world to emerging markets as an official creditor, more than G20, more than any of these other organizations, multilaterals like IMF and World Bank, means that we've got geopolitical issues that we need to address as well. But I said in the article, you know, in some sense, healthcare and economics are everywhere in the world, people are dealing with this. But the third reason why I think it's important for Western countries to think about a Marshall Plan was because there is a, shall we call it a Cold War going on between the West and the rest, led by China, on an ideological basis. And over the last 10 to 15 years, China has strengthened its imprimatur, its marker on the emerging markets world and on the world in general. I mentioned to you, China is the largest foreign lender to the US government. But around the world and also in Africa, China is the biggest, not just the biggest lender, also the biggest trading partner, the biggest foreign direct investor, and now holds much of the sovereign debt for many countries. My argument was that countries in the West, if they want to continue to compete on an ideological basis, to continue to defend ideas such as market capitalism and democracy, they need to continue to engage with countries, not just in Africa, but in the emerging world. And that is why the Marshall Plan was a suggestion that I put forward. It's worth me just saying one other thing, because a lot of people don't even bother to read anymore, which really bothers me. They make comments on social media without even bothering to read or even to think. I got a number of comments from people saying, oh, you know, Dambisa is just being opportunistic, you know, but they did not bother to read in the article where I was extremely clear that 10 years ago, I argued on page 7 of my first book, Dead Aid, I argued very clearly that there had been successful aid interventions such as the Marshall Plan. What made them successful is that those interventions were short, they were sharp, and they were finite. And that the fundamental problem with the aid system as we've known it is that it has been an open-ended commitment to give money to governments in Africa in perpetuity, which was undermining the government's effectiveness and in fact encouraging corruption. So for those people who are going to say, well, how come you seem to have changed your view? You now are a supporter of aid. Please understand a very simple concept. These are two different models that we're talking about. One of them is about being very targeted, very focused, and also extremely focused in terms of the duration. And it is not an open-ended commitment. Hafsat, I'm going to stop. I know you did ask me how exactly would we do this, and I did talk about this in the article, that we're asking, or in the article, I was asking for Western countries to get involved and support a Marshall Plan at exactly the time when the economic situation in the West is very dire.
Yes.
And in that respect, even suggesting this, this is the exact word I use, might be seen as fanciful. People might say this is completely absurd. However, I do think those three arguments, healthcare, economics, and ideological, you know, and of course the fact that we're fellow human beings should be sort of obvious, but really I thought that those three arguments were important points to make in making the case for Africa to be, to have a Marshall Plan.
I just have a quick question. Has there been much of a response to that?
Yes, I've been doing a lot of speeches on this topic. I think there's a lot of sympathy. I mean, I think that the truth of the matter is that, and this is why Dead Aid I felt was really important, is that African governments should, this is why perpetuity, free money in perpetuity is a problem, because when the day that money stops, we're extremely vulnerable.
Yeah. And
so my hope 10 years ago was that African governments would say, wow, you know, things aren't so bad, the economy's growing, life's not so bad. Let's put some money aside for a rainy day, or let's use the money wisely so that when things get tough, we can be protected. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened because we're still exposed in terms of healthcare, in terms of economics, And now we're so heavily dependent on China, and we're so vulnerable in many ways. But the response has been very positive. But the truth of the matter is, you know, as they say on airplanes, put your own gas mask on before trying to assist others. I think many people in the West now are struggling for themselves to be able to stay afloat. There's high unemployment. There's real concern that an era of digitization is upon us, which could see a lot more people lose their jobs in the West. So, you know, the notion that they'll feel sorry for Africans, I think is a hard sell. It's a hard sell.
So on that, you know, you would have noticed, Sidambisa, that all around the world, there were all these Africa summits. So in Sochi, in Russia, they had their Russia-Africa summit. They had one, I think, I mean, in China, they often have the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Yes. There's so many different summits. Actually, I think towards the end of this year in France, there will be a France-Africa summit. There was supposed to be the US-Africa summit in June, but it was postponed. And so I'm sure they'll reschedule that. And Mama Graça Machel, in response to all of these events, said that the problem in Africa is not so much lack of global attention. It's that we Africans have to decide on what is our African plan for Africa. So do you know if there's any consensus about an African plan for Africa? And if there isn't, what do you think the elements of that plan should be?
So, First Lady Graça Machel is 100% correct. But, you know, the bad news, and we'll come to some good, actionable things to move forward. I don't want people to get depressed. Don't turn to drink and drugs, please, on the back of an economics discussion. But the bad news is that I've been on this planet now, thank God, for over 50 years. And from the time I was born in Lusaka, Zambia, through my education, through the time I met you at Harvard, going to do my PhD at Oxford in economics and working not only at Goldman Sachs, but subsequently serving on corporate boards, the narrative has been the same, as far as I'm concerned, on what Africa needs to do. And if I think about how companies work, and I understand countries are not like companies, so it's a bit, it's an unfair analogy, but you touched earlier about my marathon running. I think this also applies to how people succeed in certain endeavors. It all boils down to execution. How do you get it done? And this is where Africa has been extremely disappointing. And you know, once again, I'm sure some people are saying, why are you talking about Africa like it's one country? Yes, we understand. It's notwithstanding the caveat that we're talking about 54 countries. But the bottom line is that we know that countries that trade do better than countries that don't trade. We know this. This is not rocket science. But even between us, within, you know, PTA or within ECOWAS or any of these preferential trading areas that some of them have even come and gone. There's still tariffs, still too expensive it's cheaper for me to buy something from somewhere abroad than to buy it from my next door neighbor in Angola or somewhere else from Zambia. Problem number one. Problem number two, our governments, by and large, not all of them, but by and large, are not data-driven. They are not forward-leaning. They don't really think about the future. They're not future-proofing. They are not using measured outcomes to make decisions. And unfortunately, a lot of them do remain corrupt. So government efficiency, not high. Look at the Transparency International rankings. Look at a lot of different rankings. Government is not executing in terms of improving. And then I would say the third thing that makes it really difficult is that life and society, I mean, this is a bit trite to even say this, is not static. It's constantly moving. And we're moving into much more challenging times where the people that we've relied on, the traditional donors, are struggling themselves. Think about that for a minute. We look at America and Britain and expect them to give us aid, but those countries are depending on China to give them loans. I mean, there's something wrong with this picture because China also has its own economic challenges. So execution means that we've not done as much heavy lifting as we should have done by now. And, you know, I would argue that not just in Africa, around the emerging world, a lot of governments and countries have squandered that opportunity when things were going great. They just didn't plan for the long term. So coming, if I may, just very quickly into where we are today, we need a plan, a clear plan. There's no point in us spending any more time going around the world to have photo ops. I don't think that that's a good use of our time. I think that there needs to be much more planning. You know, you might want to have an A team focused immediately on the COVID epidemic or pandemic. I don't know where that is. I mean, different countries have different views. I don't think there's any unified approach. And again, this is not just an Africa specific criticism. I think most places around the world, it's been a pretty choppy response. We wanted a B team maybe to focus on the economy. What are we going to do in a world that's deglobalized? What are we going to do when there's climate change emerging? There's issues around less immigration, more policies to block Africans from moving, more policies around trade being barred from the continent. What are we going to do in that scenario? Where is that plan? Can somebody say, here's the plan of 3 things? I don't know where that plan is. And I think the final thing is to invest in young people. We're just not doing it fast enough. We need, and people might say, well, it's a new era. We're all going to be on social media, taking selfies or whatever. But the bottom line is, we still need to have excellence in foundational studies, mathematics, reading, writing. These are the tools that are going to be important, science, for the economy that's coming. As they say, don't hit the puck where it is today. Go for where the puck is going to be tomorrow. And so that is the important thing. What do we know to be true in 10 years' time? I can assure you that technology is going to be more important. And I just don't think we're prepared enough for that.
Wow. So we have to develop a plan.
First and foremost.
Do you think the African Union is the one that should take the lead on that?
You know, my view on these things, there's a wonderful literature called mixed mental models, which is basically, you know, I think it's too easy to say that's the job of person X. Some of the most brilliant ideas have been formed in garages in the United States. Yeah. You know, whether it's a mobile phone or Google. I mean, this is young people coming up with ideas. So I'm not really wed to institutions in of themselves as the only sources of information. Even in the African context, there's that young Malawian boy who was on TED Talks, who came up with a windmill. You know, there's scope for innovation here. I don't think we need to just sit back and wait for somebody else to tell us what the answer is. What I do know is that answer has to have a lot of input from people, not just from economics or from politics. It needs to come from historians. It needs to come from anthropologists and sociologists, people from the medical field. We need a team of smart people to sit down and say, wait a second, that might work if you look at the model in a physics way, but it won't work if you think about it from a sociological approach. But I don't know where that discussion is happening. And, you know, again, I don't want to sound like I'm just berating the African continent. I think that conversation is not happening even on a global basis. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't start it.
So in terms of all the non-state actors that can make an impact, I'd like to shift the level of our conversation and look at the role that women entrepreneurs can play. So you've articulated in this conversation that even before the crisis, even before the pandemic, the economies were not strong across the continent, but that now, especially now, we are facing very strong headwinds. What opportunities do you identify that are available to help women on the continent build back better?
So, Hafsat, I think you're breaking up just a little bit. You said, what opportunities are there available for women? And then you died out.
Okay, for women entrepreneurs on the continent to build back better. The UN has come up with this phrase, build back better. And everyone is saying build back better. But what does that mean for us? For the
you have to ask the UN people. You're asking me. No, I mean, look, for me, I'm all about innovation. I tell my friends and my siblings all the time, that there will be winners and losers from this. Some of the richest people that have emerged around the world have come out of periods of crisis. And I really like something that is usually attributed to Rahm Emanuel, who was the mayor of Chicago. He used to say, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think, it goes back to what I was saying a moment ago. Instead of us worrying about, oh my gosh, Dambisa Moyo just said, hey, there's going to be low economic growth. There are going to be winners who come out of this, for sure. But I can assure you that those winners will have some coding skills, technology skills, because they are now looking for where the world is headed, and the world is becoming more digitized. So I don't know what the Build Better campaign really wants to focus on. But what I can assure you, if you said to me, Dambisa, tell me honestly, what should I be focusing on? I would say sharpen your financial skills. You better understand how to read a balance sheet, understand how to profit and loss. A lot of people aren't focused on that. But as an entrepreneur, understand what the value of capital is. How do you use it? How do you deploy it? How do you allocate capital in a way that can generate returns? But the other thing is invest in building your skills. It's not a finite thing. Oh, I graduated from Harvard or wherever, and therefore I don't need to grow. I know you, Hafsat, are spending your time constantly refreshing your skill set. That is what entrepreneurs need to do. There's no end point. And right now, as far as I can see, the way and the place where you should be investing the most amount of skills is in technology. If you want to win in the next period, you've got to have technological skills. So that's what I would say. That's a very micro way, instead of having some big ideas, because that's I'll leave that for someone else.
So I'm seeing that we have quite a few questions in the question and answer box from Lana Millen. She says, in terms of health and healthcare, what is the role of the private sector in delivering growth in the African continent? I am thinking of pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Healthcare is, in my mind, one of the 4 most important public goods. By that, I mean, we all benefit, but no one person should be paying for, pays for it. So it's things like infrastructure, street lights on the street. We all benefit, but it's not Dambisa Moyo who's paying by herself, or Hafsat Abiola who's paying for that electricity. Other public goods are education, healthcare, of course, national security. We all benefit from that, but it's not one person. That's where government is critically important. I strongly believe in pharmaceutical companies. They're critically important. As we can see, we need a vaccine desperately. A vaccine usually takes 7 to 10 years to be produced. People in the pharmaceutical industry are working around the clock right now to find a vaccine so that fewer people can die. People die from this dreadful disease. So for me, it's not an either or. I think we know that government, in terms of regulation, in terms of helping to create public policy environments that can drive better outcomes in healthcare and education, et cetera, is critical. But private sector needs to also be part of the equation. I don't know how to make a vaccine. Even though I did an undergraduate degree in chemistry, I have no idea. But I know that the largest companies, pharmaceutical companies, are incredibly important in trying to find a vaccine at a very micro level, but also for all the diseases, whether it's Ebola, Zika, SARS, the pandemics that have gone before us. In trying to find the solution to that, private sector needs to be there. They need to be at the coalface. They are the ones who understand what works and what doesn't. And that's why the probability of getting a vaccine by the end of December this year is so high, because there are people who've been working on these issues in the private sector. So I think that's a very important piece for both public and private to work together.
There's another question from Ramatullah Jallo. She says, she's asking if you've seen the article in the New York Times from this morning on the impact of climate change on Africa. That it says that a big percentage of the continent will be unlivable. And she's asking if you have any thought of the economic ramifications of climate change on Africa, as the article talks about the next 50 years, a challenge of 50 years.
Yes, I mean, again, this should not be a surprise to any of us. We've been talking about climate change and concerns about what this might mean for the world. I wrote my first, my book 2 years ago, 2018, Edge of Chaos, actually talks about climate change being one of these drags on economic growth, but also a disruptor in terms of immigration. In fact, the IRC, the International Rescue Commission, has talked about how today there are about 70 million people who are displaced and actually also refugees because of, in fact, I should say that 70 million is the highest on record, on historical record, more than the wars, global world wars. And a lot of that has to do with natural resource scarcity and climate change. But the problem with something like climate change is that we have to think about the trade-offs. I mentioned to you that when I was home in Zambia, there's still a very dire lack of access to energy in places like in Africa, but also around the world. There are about 1.25 billion people on the planet today who got no access to energy or to any access to cost-effective and sustainable energy. They're using, I'm sure many people even on this call will know that this is very problematic in terms of their ability to zoom into calls. You're hearing a lot of international universities saying, don't come back, we'll do classes online. Well, if you're sitting in Zambia and you've got load shedding, how are you going to dial in? So we have to, like most things in public policy and indeed in life, there's a trade-off that needs to be considered. We have to solve the climate change problem, otherwise we will not exist. The second order problems of that are immigration in a disorderly fashion, destruction of the environment. Nobody wants that. But at the same time, what makes it very challenging is that people need to improve their living standards. They need access to energy, they need access to food. And so it's a very delicate balance. But do I think this is a problem? Absolutely. It is absolutely a problem, and we all know that. It's a matter of coming up with solutions, and which is why not just pharmaceutical companies, but private sector companies, I think in terms of innovation, in terms of research, R&D, are very important in solving these issues.
Wow, that's just, you're so outstanding, Sissy. Really so outstanding. I'd like to also ask the second question. She said, can you reference the book on mixed mental models?
Yes, you know who the king of mixed mental models? I mean, there are a couple of books I can tell you about. There's one called Super Thinking, it was written by a married couple, but the guru of this topic is Charlie Munger, who is the right-hand man of Warren Buffett. If you type in Charlie Munger, M-U-N-G-E-R, Charlie, M-U-N-G-E-R, and put in mixed mental models, you'll find all the literature there, and you can just follow through. But there are many other people. There's something called Farnham Street that has a lot of research, but it's a good way of checking ourselves. You know, when people ask me questions, they're asking me as an economist. My PhD is in economics, but actually the answer I end up with as thinking as an economist could be completely wrong if you answer the question as a biologist or as a historian. And so really we should be forcing ourselves to think about these complex problems that the world is dealing with in a much more holistic frame. And even if we cannot be the most educated in every area, we should at least have people from other backgrounds and other experiences offer perspectives, which is why I really, really detest this whole shaming of different ideologies and people shouting down people with different views. I think that is going to be the death of us longer term, that the notion that we don't want to hear opposing views. We're smarter than that. We're better than that. We know that the arguments that we can come up with can defeat people who are not smart or have not thought through, who have weak ideas. But it's not to shout them down and keep them excluded. That is going to hurt us, whether we're trying to solve climate change or poverty or lack of education and healthcare. We will be the losers long term if we don't open our minds and be much more objective to hearing what other people have to say.
No, you're right. You're right. And I think sometimes, I don't know if you've seen that video that has been passed around about a guy from the Black Lives Matter movement going to one of these Make America Great Again campaigns. And they actually gave him the platform to speak, and then they engaged with him. afterwards.
I haven't seen that. You must send that to me.
I'll send it to you. It's very inspiring, really. And there's a question from Kathy Kerubo. She says, hello, Dr. Moyo. I read and loved your book, Dead Aid. I'm curious as to your thoughts on aid now and future prospects of aid. Will we see an age where Africa is strong enough to provide aid?
Well, so I think I touched on this already, really, in terms of where my views may have changed on the margin. I don't think it's a change of views. I just think it's a sort of a clarity in the aperture, if I could say that. It's becoming a bit more clear that there are certain scenarios where we do need aid. And right now we're in a global emergency. Yes, aid is needed. Seriously, as I said, if you've read Dead Age, I make that argument that there are cases where aid is an important and catalytic effect for an economy. I think that the issue about aid, all societies have aid in them. Developed societies have aid in them. They have charities. The point I was making was that having aid that is such a large proportion of a government's intake is where the problem lies. It's not about funding NGOs or small charities. I don't think that is as corrupting as the type of aid flows that can undermine a government's efficiency or a government's objectivity. So I think that that's really the point where I would say in terms of aid, I don't think, in fact, I know for a fact there's no society that's achieved long-term economic success or really moved a large proportion of its population out of poverty by relying on aid. And the notion that we should be relying on a system that puts us in such a vulnerable place is to me quite foolhardy. Why would you rely on a system of financing that can compromise your choices politically, but also the donors, as we're seeing now, is my worst nightmare reveal. The donors are genuinely in a cash-strapped place, and so we're probably right at the bottom of the list in terms of trying to receive aid.
So I think, yes, I think you already answered that. And I think the next question is from a friend of yours, Mara Michello from Zambia.
Okay.
Hey, hello. And she puts your name. And she says, Mara here from Zambia, listening closely. How can women entrepreneurs in Zambia leverage global opportunities for business growth? Are there global opportunities for business growth right now with all this people looking inward?
Yeah, I think it's a very hard time. I happen to serve on a number of corporate boards, and I hear from my board colleagues, this is from global companies, that I think there'll be likely quite a considerable acceleration of digitization. And we don't yet know what the consequences of that are. I mean, I talked in my book, Edge of Chaos in 2018 of technology and the risk of a jobless underclass, demographic shifts, both in terms of the quality and the quantity of the population is changing so rapidly. Income inequality is widening, natural resource scarcity and climate change, the amount of debt that the world is carrying today, 322% debt to GDP ratio. So those kind of factors are creating headwinds in society. So, when you ask about what global opportunities are there, I mean, I think the world will move on. I don't think this is the end of the world. We've had wars before. I mentioned a whole slew of challenges that the world went through in 1910 to 1930, and they managed to have the world continue. I think that, so in that regard, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have to equip yourself to being competitive in the world that is coming, not the world that you want to be in, but the world that is coming. And to me, that is a world of more deglobalization, more technology, bigger government, more tax, more regulation, and smaller government. And those are the tools you need to think about, the tools that will equip you to become much more competitive in that world.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And there's from Olivier Musafiri. Dr. Moyo, what is your view about the Africa Free Trade Agreement in relation to the impact of COVID-19? And what role do you think that, I think you just addressed this. It says, what role do you think international trade could say to boost the economy in Africa and the role of women? I think you tackled the second part of the question, but what about
I did. Yeah. So look, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. There are trade-offs. It's lives versus livelihoods right now. So the immediate thing, we want to save lives. That is absolutely important. It's important for corporations. When I'm on these board calls, what are we focused on? The health of our workers. Number one, are they alive? Are they safe? Do they need medical attention? But there is the livelihoods point as well. You know, we don't want the economy to completely collapse. That also doesn't help. So when you're thinking about these free trade agreements vis-a-vis COVID, the question is, where is that tension? Where is that trade-off between the lives, keeping people alive, but also whether or not we should be opening up the economy? This is where the debate is right now. And it goes back to what I said earlier. We can't just have healthcare people coming up with all the decisions, because on the other hand, there are economic consequences, and vice versa. So we need everyone with who, people who've got that skill set to sit down in a room to come up with the answer around that. I don't pretend to have a medical background. I have no idea what the veracity of this health pandemic could really mean for human beings. Is it going to be here with us forever? Will we become immune? Will the vaccines work? There's so many health questions I can't answer, but I can try and answer some economic questions. And I can tell you that things like debt, slow economic growth are extremely damaging for human progress and in living standards over the long term. So we need to figure out how to balance that. And as long as these free trade agreements are taking into consideration that sort of more balanced view of trying to keep people alive, but also trying to keep the economy afloat, then I think they're valuable. But without knowing the details, it's as they say, it's motherhood and apple pie. I mean, it sounds reasonable, but who knows in detail?
Yes. So one of the things that we're very much involved in at WIA is to try to get women involved in that whole debate about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. But I think that they've postponed implementation until next year. And they may postpone it yet again. I mean, it depends on the health situation. So we'll see.
Yes.
So there's a question from Jaina Baba, which sounds maybe somebody from Senegal. He or she says, you mentioned that economic growth is important to reduce income inequality. However, higher economic growth is not always poor or inclusive. In some cases, it even increases poverty. How do you reconcile economic growth and poverty reduction?
So that's a great question. And I know there have been a lot of people who have become essentially anti-capitalist and even anti-growth, which is interesting because we haven't lived in a period that I talked about where we have 20 years where there's no economic growth. For me, economic growth is important for many reasons. Some of them we've talked about. How are you going to fund education if you've got no economic growth? How are you going to fund healthcare? How are you going to fund national security? How are you going to fund innovation, new R&D, if you don't have economic growth? You can't. And in fact, if anything, one thing we know for sure from the African continent is we can see a live experiment of the consequences of there being low, slow, and indeed no economic growth over long periods of time. It's debilitating economically. It's debilitating politically, because what ends up happening is you've got such a large poor population that's not participating in the political process. In fact, in America, only 30% of people and low-income households participate in elections. 30%, that's far off of what we used to call one man, one vote. So we know that economic growth really harms not just economic livelihoods, it also affects public policy and political outcomes, but it also hurts innovation. We need innovation. We need to be at the tip of the spear. You're not going to get that type of innovation if people are hungry or living standards are not improved. There are really two ways to think about it. You can either grow the pie, so you're getting more economic growth, there's more money to fund these programs and public goods, or you can do what is becoming very fashionable, let's tax the rich and redistribution, which some people think is a good idea. Well, Hafsat and I are both in Europe today. We can tell you, I think very confidently, that for both of those strategies are very hard to execute, but I can also tell you that over the long term, I think tax and redistribution is a very dangerous path. and you think about tax and redistribution really as the aid system that we know, where money is coming from, as they used to say, the poor people in rich countries to fund the rich people in poor countries. But that was sort of tongue in cheek. But the truth is, you cannot have a system that is viable over the long period of time when there's a lack of people who are reinvesting in the economy. That is not to say that the government shouldn't be doing more or shouldn't tax at all. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it is very, very dangerous to be in a world where we're criticizing economic growth itself. We know we can do better, but I don't think an eye towards reducing or canceling economic growth is a path forward. We've seen it in Africa. We're seeing it in Europe right now, if you look at some of the numbers. And dare I say it, we're seeing it in many other parts in the world today. So it's a very important piece.
So the next question is anonymous, and it says, Africa is known to be male-dominated, especially in business. What should women do to have their voices heard and have a seat at the table in solving African issues?
So I think I'm a bit more optimistic. When I hear this question, I'm like, wow, you guys have, I don't know what generation that question is coming from, but from my generation, I am amazed. We've had 3 women presidents, you know, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, president and Prime Minister in Ethiopia. We had Dr. Banda in Malawi. We have women who are ministers, they're in public policy, they're in finance. We've had them in central banking. We've had them in many, many serious areas of government. We have serious number of women, Nobel laureates. We have women who are, African women who are business leaders. And so, you know, I'm more optimistic than that. I think things are changing dramatically. Is it the case that men are still dominating? Yes, but I think that it goes back to what I said earlier. Get your toolkit right. The world needs answers to the problems and challenges we're facing. I just don't think we're anymore in the era where people will say, oh, I can't hire that person because they're a woman, or that person is because they're Black. People want skills. They want to deploy. And by the way, I should say, I know there'll always be racists and there'll always be misogynists, but the world needs solutions quickly. And so I think it's less about focusing on sort of those tropes of, oh, you know, women and Blacks and all this stuff, and really about getting a skill set that people say, wow, we need that person in the boardroom, or we need that person on our team to solve these problems. And more, you know, I say this to women groups all the time. The competition is no longer coming from men. The competition is coming from women. You have said, you know, Melody Hobson. Melody is my best girlfriend. Melody is a Black woman. When Melody does things, I say to myself, yes, she deserves to be in that position because she is a phenomenal woman. When I see that Hafsat is doing something, she's president of WIA, I think to myself, absolutely. That woman went to Harvard. She works hard. She's always improving herself. That is the place you want to be. You don't want people to say, oh, I think that person's got the job because they're a woman or because they're Black. No, that era has gone. Now it's about skills. It's about showing up, and we are seeing it. Your competition, if you're a woman, is no longer a man. There are women out there who are doing a phenomenal job. So I'm much more sanguine about the prospects for the next generation. All I would say is stay focused on building your toolkit. You know what the world is going to look like in very broad strokes. And, you know, you only have yourself to blame if you turn around and say in 10, 15 years and say, I don't have technological skills, when we all know today that that is going to be a big piece of the answer, whatever it may be in years to come.
So, Sisi Dambisa, I know you're extremely busy, and it's now 6:59, but there are too many questions that if you because you're going to a board meeting after.
I'm afraid so, yes.
I think maybe if we just take one more question from the.
I'm going to a board meeting for 3M who are making the masks.
Oh,
so
that's important.
I have to be on that call because this is a very important thing for the world.
Yes, well done, Sisi Dambisa.
95 masks, we make those masks globally.
So I'm going to give you a choice of 3. One question is asking about visas for Africans and allocation of visas and global travel after COVID. One is asking about social impact bonds, And one is asking about the role the diaspora can play in economic growth on the continent. Which one do you want to take as your last question?
Why don't I take the diaspora?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think the visas allocation, it's too specific. I don't know which country you're talking about. I mean, that's just too specific. And obviously, I think it depends. I think more and more countries are going to start ranking the way they do in Canada. I think in the UK, they're looking at that now. So it goes back to skills again. I think if you've got more skills that the country wants, they'll take you. If you don't have skills, they won't. Just as simple as that. Social impact, I think we've kind of talked a little bit about that. But I think the diaspora, I think, is an important one. I look around, and not only is there a great desire for people who are outside of Africa to invest, importantly, but also to participate in the change in the African narrative away from poverty, war, disease, and corruption into a growth engine for tomorrow's world. But I also think that the advent of technology means that we're much more engaged in the way that Africa is portrayed and participating in the shape of the debates and discussions globally. So I think it's happening both ways. This bridge between people who are outside of Africa but looking into Africa, and people who are in Africa and looking out of Africa. And it's very heartening. I mean, I grew up. Somebody was talking to me about pen pals the other day. I grew up in the era when you have to take a pen and paper and mail it somewhere, and God knows if it would ever arrive. But now we know what's happening within milliseconds. And I think that that's very helpful in terms of economics. I think it's going to be very helpful in terms of us changing our narrative, but also in terms of coming up with ideas to help the continent to continue to progress.
So, Sister Dambisa, I want to leave you with a poem. Because just my small way of saying thank you for joining us today. And I think the one I want to leave you with is Rabindranath Tagore, is the one of his poems that he wrote. You know, he won the Nobel Prize in 1914.
Yes.
The poet. And I just really love him. It says, let me not pray to be, yes, let me not pray to be frightened of dangers, but to be fearless in facing them. Let me not pray for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it. Let me not look for allies in life's battlefield, but to my own strength. Grant me that I may not be a coward feeling your mercy in my successes alone, but let me find the grasp of your hand in my failures. All that you've shared with us today is a story, it's an unfolding story that tells us that we're coming to really a very rocky period. And everything that we know will be tested. Our communities will be tested, bonds will be tested. There will be a lot of loss not just of people, but even of position, of jobs. And then there will also be a lot of rebirth. And you gave us the story that it took 20 years when the world went through a period like this. And we hope that we will not have a war that will bring us out of it, but that human ingenuity will find a way to bring us out of it, and that women will play a very key role in that. You've said that we've moved from a world in which it's not about the sex of the person, but the skills. And you've really embodied for us and reflected to us what a powerful woman who has embraced her potential and is in the cutting edge of pursuing all our talent looks like. So we want to thank you for that, Sister Dambisa, and to say to you that your inspiration, we're going to take it with us, we're going to hold it close, and we're going to be, as I hang up, as we end this meeting today, and I go for my evening walk, I'm going to be thinking, what is the next skill that I need to be getting? And I'm going to begin to pursue it, and I'll let you know whatever it is that I decide. And I think for all the women that have been listening, to all the people, I see there have been a few men as well, we will all be doing that because the continent needs us to stop making excuses and delivering results. And we want to be that generation that does that for the continent, of turning a continent around. So thank you so much for an hour.
Let me just say en français parce que je pense que vous êtes à Brussels maintenant. I want to say à bientôt, merci beaucoup. Je suis ravie d'être ici aujourd'hui, and I'm so delighted by that poem. I love it, and thank you for being the wonderful person that you are, and my friend and my sister, albeit junior sister. I adore you very much. And I just want you to say one last thing to the audience, which is that let us not flatter ourselves. COVID is not going to be the end of the world. There's been bubonic plague, Black Deaths, there have been world wars, and society has survived. Let's just hope and pursue an outcome that leaves us in a better path when this is over. So, à bientôt, mon ami. Merci beaucoup. And je t'adore comme toujours. Au revoir.
Au revoir. À bientôt. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Bye.